YouTube, so welcome back to another video. Today we are talking about the rising sign, why it's important, what yours says about you, but also what it then says about your other angles, so the descendant, the midheaven and the fourth house cusp, or P.S Coh-lee if you are up to date with the lingo. So what this actually means is possibly even more important than most people know. I often see people call the rising sign like how you look or your way of looking out into the world, or in some cases people refer to it as a mask, and that's not really accurate. And so I really did want to do a sort of beginner level 101 video on what the rising actually is and what it affects across the chart for that reason. So like I've already said, it's not a mask. Nothing in your chart is really a mask unless we're looking at things with a bit more nuance, and then I would possibly say that mask is an okay wording, but on a blanket level it's not really something we're looking at with the rising. It is not exactly always going to be how you dress, because there's multiple factors that can come into that. It's not always going to be how you interact with friends in the world, because again there's multiple factors that come into that, but rather it is your conception of the world. So what the AC is actually showing, so the AC and DC are opposite points always. They are always in opposite signs. You will never find them not in opposite signs. So if you have an Aries rising, your DC, your descendant, is in Libra. It's not going to be in Virgo, it's not going to be in Scorpio, it is in Libra, because they are opposing points in the chart and they represent the horizon. So where the sun was sort of being seen and not seen, it is the point of light across the chart, the equator line, so to speak. So what that's actually showing for you as the chart, if you know what I'm saying, is what your conception is, going back to what I was saying. So the AC is literally when you were born, because this sign, this point, it changes sign every 2 hours roughly. It can be more or less as well. It goes through every degree, roughly a degree every 2 minutes if I recall correctly, meaning that it's a really unique point to have. Even if someone's born on the same day as you, same year, I'm sure some of you had that in school, the likelihood they're also born at the exact same minute in that instance is probably really different, especially if you notice that you are quite different people, or twins who are slightly different and seem to take on different facets. Again, they're probably not born at the exact same minute. There's probably that slight difference there. And that is something that's really important, because that just goes to show that the rising really does take up a really integral part of who we are within even our months, within our sun signs, within those who share our moon signs. All of it is shifted into the houses thanks to the rising sign. So let me explain what that means. Most people here are going to be using a Placidus chart. And even if you're using a whole signs chart, it's kind of affected by the rising sign. The rising sign in a Placidus chart, so the houses are all kind of big and small. Some seem to have 2 signs in. That's a Placidus chart. What you will see is that the rising is the first house cusp. And why that's important is because it then sets the other houses into place. So let's say you are an Aries rising and you're a Taurus sun, that is most likely going to put that Taurus sun into your second house. And if it's the whole signs chart you're using, so the AC is a kind of a moving point within the first house, that is still ultimately because of your rising sign, because that puts that sign into that first house. So again, it's still going to mean that if you're an Aries rising and you're a Taurus sun, the sun is in the second house. This will change, like outlined, every 2 hours roughly. So somebody born 2 hours after you becomes a Taurus rising, and if they're a Taurus sun as well, they now have a first house sun, and those houses show the thematic differences within the life. So just to take the example I've already used, if you're a sun in second, you might find that your ego is placed in your values, you might be kind of materialistic, whereas the person with sun in first might find that being themselves and having a persona that they can see and a concrete sense of self is what matters to them, as they like to know who they are, be that through objects or through something else. What this is showing us as a point, so the ascendant, the rising, is your understanding of you, but also how you are reacting to and navigating the world. And I think this is where we begin to get terminology like, oh, it's a how you are in the world, it's how you are with friends. It's a mask because of the idea of navigation and conception. Navigation and conception is referring to the way that I may see a predicament, the way that I may see a certain idea in life, or the way I may see myself. The first house being these sort of things that you wear on your sleeve, the self house, and things that matter to the immediate being. That does not necessarily mean that it's a mask. That does not necessarily translate to it being something which is put on in any way. But I think people sometimes get that idea because we talk about the moon being the inner emotions, and so people assume that must mean the thing which overrides that in a public facet must be a mask, but that's not true. How many times have you had a conversation with a friend and it's been funny and endearing, but you had something else going on inside, like you weren't having a great day, but that changed? This is what the rising does. That doesn't make it a mask in any way, and hopefully with that example of just how you go about life, it's easier to see that. So let's get talking about what each rising can really mean. So through the signs, I won't spend too long on this because it can take a long time, but just to name off some sort of traits of how you go about the world, we may see that an Aries rising tends to be quite spontaneous. This is somebody who doesn't get too caught up in thinking about how they see the world, but actually going about doing things, experiencing things. The Taurus rising might lean more towards sensual pleasures or the sensual side of the world. They want to feel through it in some way or to sense through it. So they may enjoy cooking because it's something of sensory sorts of pleasure and experience. They can understand their own existence. So that's the key thing here. It's about understanding existence in some way. It's kind of an information receptor. I also do like to consider the rising to be a bit like the receptacle of the senses because of that. And the Taurus rising is a really good example of this. So a Taurus rising might be more sensitive to certain things and like we said, touches, tastes, because that is their focal point and monitor of what they are experiencing life as. Moving into Gemini, we have a bubbly, chatty, information overload sort of sign. So Gemini risings tend to like to talk through life, have multiple meetings, friends, interactions, and it's very social for them. So they may understand their own existence through social aspects and be the kind to have big friend groups or to enjoy friend groups, parties, things like that, because that is a focal point for their existence. That's not to say that they rely on other people to exist, but rather that it's one way in which they are actually perceiving the world. Some people are more introverted and they perceive the world through their own internal goings on. Virgo rising could be a good example of that, for instance, to some degree, Pisces rising even. Whereas some are more extroverted, like Gemini, and are perceiving the world through that external influence. Cancer rising, the chart ruled by the moon. If you haven't seen my chart ruler video, go check it out. I should be linking it there. Well, there. But either way, the Cancer risings are people who are very emotionally fueled, and these people are actually perceiving the world through their emotions. So you see that I keep using the same words, and that's because I'm really trying to drive home the point. Cancer risings are taking in what emotionally makes sense or doesn't make sense. Their reactions and their ideas and the way they take in a belief or something coming towards them anyways is going to be based on how they're feeling about it. This isn't somebody who's information driven like a Gemini rising. They're not spontaneous in the same way that an Aries is, but rather they are spontaneously reacting in that kind of empathetic, sympathetic way, and that information is then digested through the chart. So something else that we can talk about when comparing the rising to the senses, like I did earlier, is actually the idea of digestion. So the AC could be seen as where that thing or idea, memory, whatever it may be, is being taken into the self, conceived as something within the personal experience bubble, and then digested through the chart in the necessary places. So if I was to take in a holiday, I'm perceiving it through my eyes, my lenses, my glasses, which are the rising, and then digesting it through, maybe I'm with friends, so it goes through my third house. Maybe it's a long distance travel, so it goes through my ninth house. Maybe I find a holiday date, and that's perceived through my Venus, my fifth or seventh house, something along those lines. That is not to say that that is the only way to read the rising, of course. That's just how I read it myself. Let's go through some of the other signs. Leo. So Leos are going to be perceiving their experiences and the conception of said experiences through their kind of spotlight presence and immediate instance. So I like to consider Leo to be a sign of the present. These people aren't necessarily thinking about the future nor the past, but what is currently being experienced. They're shining a light on what the selfhood means right now. And so Leo risings may tend to be very in the moment people who are very appreciative of the immediate goings on. And that's what you may see for Leo rising. When we get to Virgo, we have somebody who is selfless, very routine, likes to understand things, and also likes to plan and organize. So unlike Aries, unlike Cancer to some degree, we have someone here who is looking to actually understand their experiences with a little bit of planning and nuance. They're not somebody who's going to immediately just start doing. They want to think about why they're doing first. Libra is a other-oriented sign. This means they're extroverted, also justice-oriented. So Libras often tend to see the world through what they think is right and wrong, what benefits the most people, what is going to be most polite, respectful, and ultimately serving of others, as well as helping their relationships to others. So Libra is a planet. Libra is a sign of balance, and that's the balance that we see within them. Scorpios are researchers. Scorpio rising is somebody who wants to understand the deep roots of whatever may be going on. They may be quite perceptive, quite interrogative, and these are the traits which allow them to really have a discerning eye about what they are experiencing. Something I've seen a lot online is Scorpio rising saying that they tend to intimidate people, mostly because current generations tend to have Pluto in the first house, but also because of that deep lens which they offer to the world and their experiences. It can be off-putting to some of the more fun-loving people out there, like the Gemini risings, just for instance. Sagittarius, the experiencers, the explorers. Somewhat similar to their elemental pal, the Aries rising, a Sagittarius is going to be looking to actually take in the conception of ideas, conception of life as it's happening, the existence that is happening around them, actually through being a part of it. These are team players, love information, love philosophy, love a good debate, and it's not so much about processing information like in a textbook, like perhaps Gemini or Virgo, but processing information from the practical experiences they're going through. So having a debate, through going to somewhere, through making something, as opposed to reading or writing. Not to say they don't do those things, obviously. Now we come on to the third to last sign. Third to last, I think. I'm not sure which one is the correct grammatically, but we have the Capricorn risings. And Capricorn rising is a interesting one because these people are going to be motivated by a goal or a future sense. So they tend to conceive the world and to see it through what is going to come afterwards. They're always one step ahead in this way. It's really interesting to see because at times it can mean their downfall is that they don't see the present. But what's really interesting about Capricorn rising is that there's always that sense of something more to come, and it can seem pessimistic at times because they're very reality driven and they see the world very realistically, which of course cannot always be brilliant. However, that is also their kind of pro because they're able to be 2 steps ahead of people, 2 steps ahead of themselves, but in a very matured and perhaps all-encompassing way. So they see the world perhaps in a multifaceted way because they are able to focus on more than one stream at once because of their goal-oriented minds. Aquarius risings, so hey pals, hey queens, hey kings, Aquarius rising here too. Aquarius rising likes to see the world through ideas, but not necessarily in the same way as their Saturn friend Capricorn rising. So the Aquarius risings tend to see societies, communities. We're very aware that the world has certain schools of thought and schools of philosophy, but we also like to challenge that. So we may not necessarily fit into any particular bubble, which is why we're often considered to be quirky, weird, strange, innovative. But it's also because we just like to very much challenge the norms and to deconstruct them from the inside. So something you might notice about Aquarius rising is that they can be quite political, or they can be quite, like I said, innovative. These are people who are going to take something, to consider it, and to pull it apart, to have fun with it and explore it, because they're quite a mental sign. So the Aquarius risings are not necessarily information driven in the same way as Gemini, and not necessarily experience driven in the same way as Sagittarius, but nonetheless considerate of what's happening. And we can actually see that in their kind of symbolism. We have the water bearer. The water bearer is kind of a human symbol, one of only two in the entire zodiac, giving it that human sense, just like Virgo being the Virgin, which represents the fact that these are quite humanitarian signs. Aquarius is a humanitarian at heart, but also they're able to consider and, you know, toss things back and forth and adapt, because obviously water bearer is like a bucket coming back and forth between different things, kind of like when you separate egg yolks, separating the water and having fun with it in that way. Which brings me to the last sign for now, well, the last sign, moving on that is, which is Pisces rising. And Pisces rising is a poet, a dreamer, a muse. They're somebody who maybe sees the world through an optimistic lens or an idealistic lens. Pisces rising is somewhat similar to Taurus and Cancer, in that we have somebody who is going to be conceiving their own experience through the senses, but not so much the physical senses. So we talked about Taurus maybe being sensitive to certain tastes or flavors. Pisces is more sensitive to certain emotional ideas, so what's going on inside. This is in part because this is a Jupiterian sign, like Sagittarius. We talk about experiences with Jupiter and this sort of whole gratitude and expansion as a sign, this sort of larger than life being. In terms of Pisces, that's a larger than life inside. This is why we tend to think of them as a poetic sign, the hopeless romantic, and that is how Pisces is viewing the world. So with all the signs done, and we've talked about how we can actually view the rising, so I've told you all about my kind of personal some with the idea of the senses and the rising being like a monitor and receptor of the senses and sensory world, and then digesting it through the chart. But what we haven't talked about is actually the other points which the rising affects. So I've briefly mentioned the descendant, we have the MC and the IC, but let's kind of give it a few more points. Let's talk about those angular points a tiny bit more before I call the video off. So directly opposite the AC, we have the DC, and this is the descendant sign. Many people consider it to be something that we tend to reject in ourselves or not see in ourselves. This is in part because it sits in the 7th house, so partnerships, otherhood, business partnerships, all sorts of relationships, and it generally shows us things that we need to learn to receive. So we talked about, if we continue my personal thinking on this, of course you don't have to agree with me on this, if we consider the rising to be like a monitor and a receiver, we can consider the descendant to almost be the outshoot, so things which are going in one ear and coming out the other, partly because we don't necessarily want to receive them until we have the ability to hold on to this section, when we develop, so to speak, the descendant and take in those ideas and have that sort of conversation with ourselves about how other people or what we're receiving and don't necessarily like can benefit us. So if I was to give you an example, somebody with Taurus rising, let's go for Taurus this time. Someone with Taurus rising is going to be quite sensory, as we already discussed. They're going to be somebody who maybe enjoys fashions, they see the world in patterns maybe, and they also have a calm and quite matured, realistic take on life. However, they may not be like the Taurus descendant, because the Taurus descendant is very perhaps scolding. They're somebody who is going to see things so deeply that at times it can be hard to trust. And obviously Taurus is a Venusian sign, a Venus sign. But trust is something which Venus wants to have, especially when we consider kind of the senses, like I've already mentioned. We tend to trust that what we're perceiving of the world through our touch, through our taste, through our eyes, is real, don't we? We tend to think that. And that's what Taurus likes to find comfort in. However, Scorpio descendant doesn't. Scorpio descendant is questioning of those things. Your Scorpio friends are probably the ones who are always questioning whether we can really trust our senses. They're pulling a Descartes on you on the regular, and Taurus descendant is doing that to a Scorpio descendant is doing that to a Taurus rising. It can be difficult to want to bond with this section of the self. It's sort of that part of you that you know exists and you listen to it sometime because it is how you react with other people as well, but you don't necessarily spend much time shedding light on it in the same way you do as the more easy to access self, the rising. And so that axis and that horizon line, so they come together to form the horizon line like we talked about, is going to be something which as an individual we could all work on and kind of see which parts we may be rejecting and which parts we tend to find comfort in and maybe overemphasize to bring the whole self together. This line doesn't only affect itself though, because we also have the one going straight down the chart, which is the MC and the IC. We have the medium Coh-lee, the Coh-lee, and what these are showing is the midheaven, the goals, the self, the achievements we hope to have, the perfect self, so to speak. This, if anything, is more likely to be a mask and to be the public image we create than the rising sign is. So if you really like the idea of an astrological mask, you're looking for the 10th house, the medium Coh-lee, the midheaven, and not the rising. Below that, the exact opposite points are in the same way that the AC and DC are exact opposite. We have the Coh-lee, so the aggregate self, the things which are most anchored to you, what you grew up learning, your childhood, the things which are just so sort of integral to you because you didn't have any way of necessarily disregarding them growing up. So obviously as children, we take things in and we take some time to unlearn those things. And that's what we're seeing at the IC. The IC can be really complicated for that reason. It is showing us our memories, the great things we did as a kid, but then also if you look a bit deeper, it's going to show you teachings, ideas and beliefs which you didn't even notice you were taking in, that you didn't even notice were being scattered throughout your childhood. Or maybe for some people it's something you cannot escape even if you notice it's there, so maybe like being raised inside a certain belief system. The IC is going to show that and to show how those things are affecting you as well as sort of going forward in the chart. So for instance, maybe your IC is ruled by Cancer and your moon is then kind of a problem placement for you. That's something that we can begin to see as kind of detailing you thanks to that past. Going up to the top of the chart with the midheaven, medium Coh-lee, we have the ideal self, so to speak, who you want to become, what you want the public to see of you. To some extent, this is the online persona, although we can also look to the 11th house for how the online persona actually manifests, because that would be communities. However, the 10th house is the idealized self, be it the ideal self you have in the future, or maybe for some people, depending on the chart, how they already see themselves, or even for some people at some different stages of life. What the midheaven is going to show you is irrelevant of how you're currently processing life, irrelevant of what you maybe don't necessarily want to process, irrelevant of what you have already learned, where you hope to go. And it's really important to consider this aspect, but mostly because it's important to consider alongside these three other placements, because putting them all together, we get a whole compass of different forms of self. We see who we already are without necessarily wanting to see, perhaps a sense of a shadow that we don't necessarily enjoy looking at. We have the deeper self and we have the higher self if we're looking at spiritual terms here. Not to say that those are the exact words you have to use by any means, those are just my personal ones to illustrate my point today, but this kind of compass we see across the chart is going to be setting the foundations for everything else. Not only because it literally defines your house cusps, obviously the MC in Plastis is going to be your 10th house cusp, AC 1st house, DC 7th and IC 4th, but also because without these certain angular points, what would we have to go off of? Sure, we'd know what our emotions are thanks to the moon, or we may know how our drive is like thanks to the Mars, but it's where and how we integrate those things into our lives that we can begin to see through the angular points. So that is the video for today. I hope that you enjoyed it. I hope that maybe this has given you something to think about. Disclaimer that obviously everything I've mentioned today is based in what I've learned over the years of these things, but also my personal takes on them. So you're absolutely free to disregard any specific metaphors or words. You don't have to take them at all, but hopefully it's been helpful or educational in some way nonetheless. Why don't you go below, tell us about your rising and maybe something which you've noticed about it thanks to this video. But until next time, I will leave you all for now, YouTube. Bye for now.